To understand what Zak Bagans found in that room, you first have to understand the location that contained it, because the building itself is not incidental to this story. It is the reason the room existed, the reason what was inside it accumulated to the degree that it did, and the reason that the Ghost Adventures crew, which has investigated hundreds of locations across more than 20 seasons of television, treated this particular property with a level of preparation and caution that went beyond anything they had applied to a location in years. The property sits in a part of the American interior that has a documented history of paranormal activity stretching back more than a century, a region where the land itself carries a weight that local historians and indigenous knowledge keepers have described in terms that modern paranormal investigation has only recently developed a framework to begin engaging with seriously. The building on that property was constructed in the early part of the 20th century and has passed through a series of owners and occupants whose histories form a chain of trauma and violence and psychological deterioration that is almost without parallel in the documented records of haunted locations in the United States. The first owner died inside the building under circumstances that were ruled accidental, but that the people closest to the situation at the time described privately in terms that suggested something more deliberate. The families that followed experienced patterns of conflict, illness, and psychological breakdown that were consistent enough across different occupants with no shared history to suggest that whatever was generating those experiences was attached to the property rather than to the people who passed through it. By the time the building came to the attention of paranormal investigators, it had been vacant for more than a decade, and the investigators who had attempted to document it in that time had produced accounts that were consistent in one specific detail above all others. Every account from every investigator who had spent time in the building referenced the same room, not the basement, which was where the most visible physical evidence of the building's history had accumulated, not the upper floor, which had produced the most dramatic equipment responses in previous investigations. The room that every account returned to was a mid-level room in the interior of the building, accessible through a narrow corridor that the building's original plans did not include, suggesting it had been added or modified after original construction for a purpose that the available records did not document. Paranormal investigators who had entered that room described experiences that did not fit the standard categories of haunted location phenomena. Not voices, not apparitions, not the cold spots and electromagnetic anomalies that characterize most active locations. What they described was something more fundamental and more difficult to articulate, a sense of accumulated presence that was unlike anything they had encountered in other locations, and a physical and psychological response to being inside that room that several of them described as the single most disturbing experience of their careers as investigators. When Zak Bagans learned about the room, he made it the primary focus of the Ghost Adventures investigation, and what he found inside it when he finally entered was something that the production made a deliberate decision not to put on television. The chain of information that eventually brought Zak Bagans to that room began not with a network pitch or a location scout, but with a private communication from someone within the paranormal research community whose identity has been carefully protected by everyone involved in the subsequent investigation. What is known about the source is that they had direct personal experience with the location and with the room specifically, that their encounter there had been serious enough to prompt them to reach out to Zak rather than to any of the other investigators they had professional relationships with, and that the terms of their communication made clear from the beginning that what they were describing was not the kind of story that gets submitted to a television production in the ordinary way. They were not pitching a location, they were issuing a warning, and the warning was specifically addressed to Zak because the source believed, based on their knowledge of his history with the most extreme investigations Ghost Adventures had conducted, that he was the person most likely to understand what they had encountered and most likely to be equipped, practically and psychologically, to engage with it in a way that did not simply make the situation worse. The warning itself, as it has been described by people with knowledge of the initial communication, was detailed in ways that distinguished it from the generalized accounts of dangerous locations that reach Zak Bagans through various channels on a regular basis. The source described specific physical characteristics of the room that matched the accounts of previous investigators who had no connection to each other. They described specific experiences inside the room that they had not shared publicly, and that could not have been derived from any available documentation of the location. And they described what they believed to be the nature of what had accumulated in that room over the building's history in terms that Zak, according to people close to him who were aware of the communication, found compelling enough to immediately begin the process of pursuing access to the property. That process took months. The property had passed into private ownership, and the current owner was not eager to facilitate a television investigation of a room that they were privately aware had produced serious effects on previous visitors. The negotiations around access were extended and involved conditions that Ghost Adventures had not agreed to for any previous investigation, conditions related to what could be filmed, what could be broadcast, and what obligations the production would have to the property owner in the event that the investigation produced material of a specific character. Zak agreed to those conditions. The fact that he agreed, that he accepted terms he had never accepted before in order to gain access to a single room in a building that most people had never heard of, tells you something significant about what the initial warning had communicated to him, and about how seriously he was already taking what he was going toward. Before Zak Bagans and the Ghost Adventures crew entered that room, a number of paranormal investigators with varying levels of experience and credibility had been inside it, and the accounts they produced, taken together, form a body of testimony that is remarkable for its consistency across people who had no contact with each other and no shared framework beyond the basic vocabulary of paranormal investigation. The earliest documented account comes from a local investigator who entered the building in the years immediately following its abandonment, before it had gained any significant reputation within the paranormal community, and before the room had been identified as the focal point of the property's activity. This investigator, who has since left the field entirely, described entering the room as part of a general survey of the building and experiencing an immediate and overwhelming physical response that they initially attributed to the air quality in an enclosed space that had been sealed for an extended period. But the physical response did not resolve when they moved back into the corridor, and it did not fully dissipate when they left the building. They described residual effects lasting several days, a persistent sense of being observed, intrusive thoughts that did not feel like their own, and a quality of sleep disturbance that they had not experienced before, and that stopped abruptly approximately a week after the visit. They did not return to the building and did not discuss the experience publicly for several years. The investigators who followed, including 2 separate teams who entered the building within a 5-year period without knowledge of each other's findings, produced accounts that mirrored the first in their core details, while adding specificity that the first account lacked. Both teams reported that their equipment behaved differently inside the room than it did anywhere else in the building, not simply registering higher readings on standard instruments, but responding in patterns that neither team could account for within the conventional frameworks of electromagnetic interference or environmental contamination. One team's audio recording equipment captured material inside the room that their technical consultant, after extended analysis, described as unlike any EVP he had reviewed in 20 years of paranormal audio work, not because of what it said, but because of its acoustic properties, which suggested a source that was neither environmental nor the result of any recording artifact he could identify. The other team lost a member during the investigation, not to physical harm, but to a psychological event inside the room that required the person to be removed from the building, and that resulted in them seeking professional support in the weeks that followed. That team's written account of what occurred, which has circulated privately within the paranormal research community for years, describes the room in terms that every subsequent investigator who has read it and then entered the room independently has confirmed as accurate in their own experience. The room does not feel like other haunted spaces. It feels like something that is not a haunting in the conventional sense has been using that room as a fixed point for a very long time. The Ghost Adventures crew arrived at the property in the late afternoon, following the extended preparation protocol that Zak had established for this investigation, and that differed from their standard pre-lockdown process in several specific ways. Additional equipment had been brought that had not been used in previous investigations. A specialist in a field that the production has not publicly identified had been consulted in the weeks prior and had provided guidance that shaped specific elements of how the investigation would be structured, and the conditions agreed to with the property owner, which included restrictions on what could be filmed in certain areas, and a specific protocol around the room itself, had been reviewed and confirmed before the crew entered the building. The early hours of the investigation were, by the accounts of people present, consistent with what the location had produced for previous investigators. Equipment responses throughout the building that suggested active and intelligent presence. Personal experiences among the crew that ranged from the mildly unusual to the genuinely unsettling. An atmosphere in the building that the crew, despite their collective experience across hundreds of investigations, described as among the more oppressive they had encountered. But the room had not yet been entered, Zak had made the deliberate decision to approach the room later in the investigation, after extended time in the building had calibrated the crew's equipment to the baseline conditions of the location, and after the investigation had established clearly that whatever was in the building was aware of the crew and actively responding to their presence. By the time Zak moved toward the corridor that led to the room, the investigation had already produced material that the crew considered significant. What they had documented in the broader building had set a context for the room that none of the previous investigators who had entered it cold had possessed. Zak went into the corridor alone. This was a specific decision that the crew had discussed and that Aaron had expressed reservations about. Reservations that Zak had heard and set aside. The cameras followed him to the entrance of the corridor and then stopped, because the conditions of access agreed to with the property owner required that the room itself be entered without camera operators, with only Zak's personal recording equipment capturing what happened inside. He was in the room for a period of time that the people outside described differently depending on who was asked, but that was longer than anyone expected and longer than the protocol had anticipated. When he came out, the crew has described his appearance and demeanor in terms that are consistent across every account. He was not the Zak Bagans who had gone into that corridor. Something about the way he was holding himself, the way he was processing what had just happened, the quality of his silence in the minutes after he emerged, told everyone present that what he had found in that room was not what any of them had prepared for. The accounts of what Zak Bagans actually encountered inside that room are the most carefully guarded element of this entire story, and the care with which they have been protected across the time since the investigation took place is itself a significant piece of information about the nature of what was found. The people who know what happened in that room have not spoken about it publicly. Zak himself has addressed it only in terms that confirm something significant occurred while refusing to describe what that something was. The conditions of access agreed to with the property owner prohibit specific categories of disclosure, and the production company has made editorial decisions around the investigation footage that reflect a level of institutional caution that goes well beyond the ordinary process of shaping raw material into broadcast content. What has emerged, through the careful and partial accounts of people with proximity to the situation, is a picture assembled from fragments rather than from any single complete account. What those fragments suggest, taken together, is that what Zak found in that room was not a presence in the conventional sense of haunted location phenomena. It was not an apparition, not a voice, not the kind of physical manifestation that Ghost Adventures has documented at other locations and built episodes around. What the fragments suggest is that Zak encountered something inside that room that confronted him with information, specific and personal information about his own history and his own psychological interior that he did not expect and that could not have been derived from any source available to any entity operating within the conventional understanding of what haunted locations contain. The accounts describe Zak emerging from the room in possession of knowledge that he went in without, knowledge about specific events in his past that he has not discussed publicly, knowledge about specific individuals connected to his personal history, knowledge that was accurate, that he has not disputed, and that the people closest to him confirmed when he described it to them afterward. How that knowledge was communicated to him inside the room, through what mechanism or means, is the part that none of the accounts address directly, because it is the part that Zak has been most absolute in declining to describe. What the people close to him know is that whatever form the communication took, it was not something he had experienced before in any of the hundreds of locations he has investigated over 20 years, and that the experience of receiving that information in that room left marks on him that have not fully faded. Whatever occurred inside that room during Zak's solo investigation, the effects were not confined to the psychological and informational experience he described to the crew afterward. There was physical evidence, documented by the crew in the minutes and hours after Zak emerged from the corridor, that something had happened inside that room that left traces on both the investigator and the recording equipment he had been carrying. The most immediate physical evidence was on Zak himself. The crew documented marks on his skin that had not been present when he entered the corridor, and that could not be attributed to contact with the physical environment of the room in any conventional way. The marks were described by people who saw them as unlike the scratches and contact marks that Ghost Adventures crew members have sustained during investigations at other active locations, different in their pattern and in their apparent depth, and located on areas of his body that the configuration of the room and his documented movement within it made it difficult to account for through accidental contact with surfaces or debris. Zak's personal audio recording equipment, which had been functioning normally throughout the investigation up to the point of his entering the corridor, captured material material inside the room that the production's audio consultants spent extended time analyzing before providing an assessment. The nature of that assessment has not been publicly disclosed, but the fact that it required extended analysis rather than the relatively straightforward review process that Ghost Adventures applies to most EVP and audio material captured during investigations suggests that what the equipment recorded was not standard in its characteristics. The static camera that had been positioned at the entrance to the corridor, capturing the exterior of the room's door during Zak's time inside, documented a series of environmental anomalies in the space between the camera and the door that the crew's technical equipment was able to measure but not able to explain within the framework of the location's baseline conditions. Temperature variations, electromagnetic readings, and light anomalies that occurred specifically during the period of Zak's presence in the room and resolved when he emerged. The cumulative physical evidence from the period of Zak's investigation of the room was assessed by the production team as among the most significant and most difficult to conventionally explain of any material captured during the investigation as a whole, and it was assessed along with Zak's personal account of what occurred inside, as part of the basis for the decision that the production made about what would and would not be included in the broadcast version of the episode. The decision not to broadcast what Zak Bagans found in that room was not made quickly or without significant internal discussion within the production, and understanding that decision requires understanding both the specific content that was being withheld and the broader institutional framework within which the Ghost Adventures production operates and makes its editorial choices. The most straightforward element of the decision was the conditions agreed to with the property owner before access was granted. Those conditions, as described by people familiar with their content, included specific restrictions on the broadcast of material captured inside the room that the production had accepted in exchange for access they could not have obtained otherwise. The property owner had consented to the investigation with an understanding of what would and would not be made public, and the production was bound by that understanding regardless of what the investigation produced. But the conditions of access were not the only factor in the decision, and the people close to the production are clear that they would not have been sufficient on their own to drive the editorial choice that was made. Even without those restrictions, the production would have faced a serious question about whether the material from inside the room was appropriate for broadcast, and that question would not have had an easy answer. The nature of what Zak encountered in that room, specifically the personal and specific character of the information that was communicated to him inside it, raised a category of concern that Ghost Adventures had not navigated before. Broadcasting that material would have required Zak to make public things about his personal history that he had not chosen to make public, in a context where the source of that information was something that the audience would have no conventional framework for processing. The production's psychological consultants, who reviewed the footage and Zak's account of his experience, raised concerns about the potential impact on both Zak himself and on viewers who had their own histories of psychological distress or trauma, arguing that material of this specific character required a level of contextual framing and audience preparation that a standard Ghost Adventures episode format could not provide. There were also concerns raised by religious and spiritual advisors who were consulted about the nature of what the room appeared to contain and about the implications of broadcasting material that documented contact with it. Those concerns were taken seriously in a way that reflects how the production had evolved in its understanding of what it was dealing with in the most extreme investigations, and they contributed to a consensus that broadcasting the room material without the ability to adequately prepare or protect the audience was not a risk the production was willing to accept. The investigation of that room and what Zak Bagans found inside it did not end when he walked out of the corridor and rejoined his crew. The effects of what occurred inside that room followed him out of the building and into the weeks and months that came after, and the people closest to Zak during that period describe a man who was working through an experience that had no precedent in his career and that did not resolve through the mechanisms he had previously relied on to process the extreme encounters that Ghost Adventures investigations regularly produced. Zak has spoken publicly, in general terms, about the psychological cost of the work he does and about the cumulative effect of 2 decades of exposure to locations and presences that most people never encounter in any form. He has discussed what he believes are attachments, the residual influence of entities or energies from extreme locations that follow investigators beyond the boundaries of the physical space where the encounter occurred. He has described episodes of behavioral and psychological disruption in the aftermath of certain investigations that he attributes to these attachments, and that have required various forms of spiritual and psychological intervention to resolve. What the people around him describe in the aftermath of this specific investigation goes beyond the pattern of those previous experiences in both intensity and duration. The information information Zak received inside that room, accurate and specific as it was, did not stop being significant once the investigation was over. It continued to occupy a central position in his thinking in a way that the crew around him found unusual, even by the standards of his post-investigation processing, and that several people close to him describe as having contributed to changes in his behavior and priorities that were visible across the months following the investigation. The physical marks documented on his body after emerging from the room took longer to resolve than similar marks from previous investigations, a fact that his personal physician noted without being able to offer a conventional explanation for the delayed healing. His sleep was disrupted in ways he has described to people close to him as qualitatively different from the post-investigation sleep disturbance he had experienced before, involving not nightmares in the conventional sense, but a quality of continued contact with whatever he had encountered in that room that did not observe the boundary between the location and the rest of his life in the way that previous encounters had. The person who went into that corridor and the person who came out of it and went on to continue making ghost adventures are not identical, and the people who knew both versions are clear about that distinction. What Zak Bagans found in that room changed something in him that has not changed back.